everyone, and welcome back to our town. We are now in the 1930s. Our town has expanded into a new exciting neighborhood built especially for all the new people that are now in Britain. As the population rises, we have world events like the Great Depression, and by the end of this era we have the start of the Second World War as well. So we'll start off with some population facts. How exciting. So at the beginning of this era in 1931 there was around 46,074 million people living in Britain. And by the end of this era in 1939 there was around 47,000 million, whatever number, I cannot speak today. And the climate hasn't changed that much. There hasn't been any real spike in temperature or anything. There are kind of lots of below average months and a lot of rainfall, and we had some warm summers, but sums it up as dull and wet, which is what most of the weather is like in the UK. So things never change. Our food is slightly more interesting as we're in the interwars period. Sort of more processed foods were coming available, and instant foods that were in jars and in powder, and just kind of save people time in the kitchen. Ow. And they didn't have to cook or prepare these foods, and it would kind of help for the next era as well, especially when food became rationed and stuff like that. We had a lot more imports as well from around the world, and getting in different types of fruit and vegetables that people hadn't seen before or experienced. Everything was a lot better quality, and the hygiene of it was increasing as well, so people's diets were getting a bit better. We also had some new technologies as well coming in to this era, as obviously our manufacturing and electronics and stuff was getting better. We had finally refrigerators, or ice boxes as they were known as, and they were regularly in people's homes so people could store their food and have it last longer as well. In 1934, school children were actually given milk as a national requirement for better nutrition, especially amongst the poorer students and stuff. They wanted everyone to be fit and healthy and sort of get all the daily things that you need to grow and learn and stuff like that. So things were improving slightly on that front, but obviously by the end it goes a bit to pot because of the war. Our money was changing as well, as in America we obviously at this time we had the Great Depression, and it didn't affect us too much here in the UK, but obviously we did feel some effects from it. So we did have some mass unemployment. However, this was already from the 1920s, and it kind of carried over into the 1930s. So in 1933 unemployment was at 22.8%. It did fall after this, and by 1938 it was only around 10%. It also depended on where you lived in the country as well, because further north there wasn't the new industries and stuff like this, but if you were in the Midlands and if you were in the south you would have the new industries of making cars, aircrafts and technologies as well. We also had people who were in jobs, they had better living standards, and that was increasing because they were getting a little bit more money for what they were doing. At this time, a bungalow would cost you only £225, and a semi-detached house would cost you £450, which would be ridiculous if that still happened these days. I wish it did cost that much because it would save people a lot of money and that is probably cheaper than mostly everyone's rents, to be honest. For middle class people who did have the jobs and their better living standards, they would be able to go out and purchase some new stuff like radios, telephones, three-piece suits, which weren't new, but we should definitely bring those back for now, and cookers, vacuum cleaners, all fancy new technologies to help them around the house with our fancy new electronics industries and stuff like that. So our foreign policy, obviously a very important time for that in this era. Obviously we have the rise of Hitler into power by 1933, and in Italy we have Mussolini, or I think that's how you pronounce his name, but he was a little bit earlier in 1923, and it was kind of the rise of the dictator, and kind of that comes into a bit more play later on in this era. And Britain and France also led the way with policy on the non-interference of the Spanish Civil War, which happened in 1936 to 1939. By 1938, war was inevitable, and Britain was trying to implement some steps to try and stop this. Obviously, Germany had gone into Czechoslovakia and they tried to put in place so they didn't seize the whole entire country. Obviously, this didn't happen, and Germany ignored this anyway and took over Czechoslovakia. And it was kind of the final straw when Britain and France said they would protect Poland, and obviously Germany went in and invaded Poland as well. So Britain and France declared war in 1939. This also did somewhat help our cinema and radio, and during the 1933 to 1945, a lot of the Jewish people who lived under Nazi control, obviously the ones who could flee and escape, came over. A lot of these people were filmmakers and actors, and they really injected a lot of creativity and a different spark into our art industry. And there were also lots of big palaces being built for huge audiences that wanted to see Hollywood films. A big influx of Hollywood films and American culture and stuff. There was some people who were like more traditionalists were kind of getting worried that there was too much American culture, which kind of feels like the same things that people used to say throughout every decade, especially later on when we get to like the 80s and the 90s and stuff. So some things never do change. In reading and literature terms, in 1935, Penguin Books actually published their first ever softback paper book. So it was cheaper to make, so they could sell it cheaper and sell it in shops that were also cheaper as well, like Woolworths. So it meant that people had more access to books and to knowledge as well. They did try and target the kind of middle class literate people. I'm being illiterate at the moment, and kind of based it for them, but obviously it being cheaper then anyone could afford these books. We also had the Mills and Booms books, which are some soppy romantic books, and for basically women trying to get together with men in different romantic ways. If you've ever seen them in the weird trashy romantic section they always have in bookshops, they are those. We also had a lot of adventure magazines for kids, especially for boys, which kind of glorified the heroes of the First World War and kind of were slightly propagandering them into fighting in the next war, which they may have been old enough to have to do so. We also had new children's comics in 1937 of the Dandy comic, and it was one of the first comics to actually have bright colours and a unique illustrative style, and kind of set the tone for the children's sort of market from then. And the year later, in 1938, we also had the Beano comic as well, which brought us characters like Dennis the Menace and stuff, which is still around at this time. Onto our housing, which is what this series is all about. In 1931, we started off with 9.4 million houses in the UK, and by 1939 we had over 11.3 million houses. So we did a lot of house building over this time to make sure everyone had a decent place to live. There was 214,000 council houses built by 1939. This was replacing all the really bad quality houses and slums and stuff of the late Edwardian era, trying to get rid of all those types of places. And we had terraced houses, which were the ones that we saw at the beginning, and we're still in, and they're all big long rows of houses, and also a lot of semi-detached housing as well, which we'll see in a bit. And we had lots of estates, so this kind of whole area would look exactly the same in a similar style and stuff to match the sort of era they were built. You always see 1930s houses all together. They were built all at the same time in one big block. A lot of the houses were still similarly built in the Edwardian type of thing, with the big bay windows out the front and having second floor as well, but they don't stick out as far. They're not quite as lavish as the Edwardian houses. And we also don't have the little exposed beam pitched roofs as well covering over them. We've got kind of a different roof shape for the 1930s. We've got these big long small square roofs that go right over the bay window and kind of hang off the house as well. It's a classic feature for the 1930s house. And obviously when we have a terraced house, they've built the roof so it covers over a multitude of houses as well. So we've got different type of roofing, and we've also got a little bit different bricks as well. So we've got a little bit of darker brick, a bit more of a skilled bricklaying and stuff like that. And we've also got different materials used for the bay windows themselves. Sometimes they would be matching the roofing materials. So like on this semi-detached house, we've got a bit more of a roof texture. On the terrace houses, we've got a different type of brickwork. And sometimes if you're a little bit more fancier, you probably have a bit of a stucco rendering or something like that. Obviously we've got rid of the beams at the top, and everything's a little bit more closed in, a little bit more boxy, a bit more square, to kind of reflect the sort of art deco-y type of stuff and modernism that was happening at the time. We also had gardens at the front, at the back, which would also be incredibly useful when we get into the 1940s. A lot of the houses I built here have lots of planters at the back, and obviously Anderson shelters as well for when the war hits, so they can grow a lot of their own vegetables and stuff like that. The semi-detached houses actually had the driveways at the front because more and more people were getting cars. So, well, the lucky few could have a car, so we've got little driveways, we've got green spaces. It's all a bit more green and homely and more sort of uniform, with a little brick wall out the front to make your own little house and your own space as well. So the homes always used to have white windows and white doors that contrast really well with the actual exterior dark bricks and stuff. So on the interior that we've already seen in the earlier house, we've got a big range of different styles, because obviously some of the houses would carry over from the 20s with the Art Deco style, and then we've obviously can move into like a Bauhaus style, which we'll see in a bit. And we have sort of a more traditional sort of house in the one that we saw the interior of first. So we've got small pattern wallpapers on the walls, a bit of floral, a bit of like geometric. Got curvy chairs with the big curved armrests were a big thing at this time period as well. We've got angular fireplaces, lots of Art Deco influences, geometric rugs, dark woods. They like to use browns and orange and yellows, and they had lots of coloured bathrooms and kitchens as well, which will influence the coming eras as well. And it would be lots of fun new inventions to go in the kitchen soon as well. So we also have one of the best styles in my opinion at this time period as well, the Bauhaus, which started in Germany. It started in 1919 and sadly ended in 1933 when Adolf Hitler told them all to get out of the country because of their ideologies. So it was started as an art school in Germany and was founded by Walter Gropius. He was originally an architect, even though they didn't get an architect part in the school until much later on. And Bauhaus literally means building house, and it influenced all the arts, architecture, graphic design, interiors, industry, and typography as well. So it's one of my favourite styles to go to as well. And it was all about form over function, and the form making practical objects into beautiful objects. So the function would come before the form, and the function that would make it beautiful is the basic thing. It was influenced one modernism and some Scandinavian stuff, and also William Morris as well. Obviously took a little bit different turn to the Art Deco style that we had more in America and in the UK as well. And it had simplified forms, rational and functional. It also had a big play into thinking about mass production as well, making things cheaper, easier for people to get to, and making people more equal because they could have nice functional things that everyone could afford to have but were beautiful in their own right. The architecture wise, as we see in this house, it was very functional. We have a lot of primary colours injected into it. We have lots of intersecting horizontal lines and vertical lines and planes. We have wings that span off from each other. Everything's connected together like a bit like a wheel or something. And then lots of the materials that they used in their builds was steel, glass and concrete. So they whitewashed the outside as well. So a lot of their buildings had the big black lines down the windows, and then the stark white building with the big grey concrete pillars and stuff like that. And it was structurally and symbolically kind of built that way to make sure the building worked as functionally as possible. And they had the large long plate glass windows that had the steel lined within them. And it also was kind of tried to look as though it was mass produced as well, so that they could easily reproduce these things to make quick and affordable houses. And that was the intention anyway. Lots of clean lines, square rectangular buildings, concrete pillars, bridges that connected them across, because it'd be more functional for you to walk across than try and go down and then out and then back into another building. And it was abstract, and lots of white and greys and primary colours as we see as we get through this build. So we go on to some fun facts of this era. So in the 1930s, there was a fun BBC report on a live radio programme that said there was literally no news, which is what I found hilarious, and I think they should do that a bit more often instead of putting on ridiculous news stories all the time. And it was also the first Miss Marple novel, and the Amazons and the Swans book was also published at this time. In 1931, the Highway Code was introduced and is clearly not followed by anyone these days, and it pisses me off. And Abbey Road Studios was open as well. In 1932, Weetabix was first in people's homes and regularly, obviously, still eaten to this day. And the Hoover Building was built as well, so it is a big Art Deco building produced by the Hoover Company, who also built lots of Hoovers, as you could tell by the name. In 1933, the first ever underground diagram, or as we know, the underground tube map, was released to the public. It was obviously a lot different than it is today. It was a lot more clean lines, a bit more Bauhaus inspired as well, so it didn't really reflect the distance of the actual tube. Oh, it did reflect the distance of the tube stops, and now it doesn't. I always forget which way around it is, but yeah, it used to reflect the actual distance, so it looked very different. And it was also the first sighting of the Loch Ness Monster, and obviously people have claimed to see it ever since. And Battersea Power Station was opened for the first time and produced London's electricity supply, and now if you come to London and see it, it's covered in cranes and it's being turned into a housing complex. So if you want to live in Battersea Power Station, if you've got a couple of million, then you can. Also, along with that, the national grid was introduced, giving everyone a nationalised power system. And Winston Churchill gave his first speech about condemning Germany's actions and the atrocities they were doing. In 1934, the cat's eyes, so the little shiny things in the middle of the road, were first introduced, and they were on the British roads by 1935, keeping us safe in the dark. And the Meccano Dinky toys were also released at this time, so they were little metal cars and trains and stuff. And a 54-year-old grandmother became the first woman to parachute skydive from 1,500 feet, and it's something I could not do, so that is very impressive. And the story of Mary Poppins was also published as a children's story. In 1935, the driving test became compulsory, and the movie 39 Steps had its UK release from America, which was very anticipated and widely accepted. And the first ever bit of steel was produced at one of our manufacturing plants as well. In 1936 was the first Butlins holiday camp to open, and this is like a place where people could go for entertainment, and they'd stay in little holiday lets. They couldn't afford to spend, like, pay out to go to like a hotel or anything. It was kind of a nice affordable way for people to go on holiday. The speaking clock was also introduced, and you could ring up a number and it would tell you the time. Sadly, this doesn't exist anymore. They got rid of it a few years ago, which is really sad. And the Turing machine paper was published by obviously Alan Turing, who went on to create the Enigma machine in the next era. And Crystal Palace was destroyed in a fire, and the red phone boxes were introduced as well to the nation. And in 1937, the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich was open, and the 909 emergency number was also introduced as well, and the publication of The Hobbit. And in 1938, gas masks were introduced, and we're getting into a bit more war-related things. Also, the first kinder transporting children, especially Jewish children, from Berlin to Britain also happened, and green belts were introduced to save the British landscape. And in 1939, the first ever Anderson shelter was built, which you've seen throughout this build, me building them in the gardens. The Women's Land Army was up and running, and the evacuation of children from major cities was also happening at this time as well. And blackouts were also imposed as well. So we saw in the furnished house the little things across the windows, and all the blinds were drawn so no one could have any light. So that is all from our 1930s version of our town. I will leave you with a little walkthrough so you can see all the insides and stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!